On the morning of November 19th, 1999, Carolyn Stahl had an extra bright smile on her face as she saw her patients at her eye clinic in Long Beach, California. Sure, it was another busy and hectic Friday, but it was also Carolyn's 44th birthday, and her husband Ken was going to take her out to dinner the next night to celebrate. In many ways, Carolyn and Ken Stahl were a classic Orange County power couple. She was an optometrist, and he was an anesthesiologist at a nearby hospital. They lived in a condo in a gated community, and Carolyn's interior design talents had made their home the envy of all their friends. And with no children at home, Carolyn and Ken liked to spend their money on things like expensive clothes, travel, and extravagant hobbies, like Ken's antique sword collection. But even with all that wealth, Carolyn had always remained down to earth. She was sweet to her friends, and she remembered their birthdays and other special occasions with cards and gifts. She talked to her mother back in her native Michigan at least twice a week, and she was planning a trip back home for the holidays to see her. And Carolyn took special care of Ken and always made sure he had whatever he needed. Carolyn even picked out the seeds from Ken's watermelon because she knew he couldn't stand them. Carolyn remained in a great mood that day as she gave eye exams to one patient after another. And it was the first time in a while she'd felt like everything was going well in her life, because she and her 57-year-old husband, Ken, had been through a lot that year. Ken had been having heart problems, and a few months earlier, he had undergone an 8-hour operation to restore proper blood flow. The surgery had left Ken feeling weak and depleted for months in a way Carolyn had never seen before. Carolyn knew that bad hearts ran in Ken's family. His father had died from a heart attack, so she really didn't take her time with her husband for granted. And recently, Ken had finally started feeling much better, and he told Carolyn how excited he was to go out with her for her birthday, and so Carolyn was so excited. Ken planned to take them to a Mexican restaurant in the pretty town of San Juan Capistrano, and then after dinner, they'd go on a romantic stroll near the historic Spanish mission in the area, and Carolyn thought this was a perfect way to celebrate her birthday, and to celebrate a new start for the couple. The following day, Saturday, November 20th, Ken was busy getting ready for his and Carolyn's big night out, and he really wanted everything to go perfectly. If Carolyn was sweet and sociable, Ken was intense and ambitious. He always felt like he was following in his father's footsteps and not quite measuring up. Ken was the only son of a prominent anesthesiologist who had once owned a hospital and made the news all the time. By comparison, Ken had only managed to get himself appointed to an obscure medical board, and he never seemed to fly quite as high as his father. Ken was really close to his mother, but he suspected that even she thought his career was less impressive than his father's had been. Ken also had this growing sense that he was running out of time. He worked out like a maniac to stay fit, and routinely went on 25-mile hikes and day-long bike rides. He was naturally athletic and had gone to college on a football scholarship, but Ken knew he had very likely inherited his father's heart problems, and so he was unlikely to live to a ripe old age. But this really only served to make Ken more driven to succeed in the time that he had. But on that particular Saturday, as Ken got ready, he actually found himself feeling quite relaxed. And when Carolyn walked into the room he was in, wearing a pretty red dress and seemingly all the gold and diamonds she owned, Ken just stared and smiled. Ken finished getting ready, then took his wife's hand, and they walked outside together. They got into Ken's car, pulled out of their gated community, and set off on the 25-mile drive to San Juan Capistrano for their big birthday dinner date. At 10 p.m. that night, Deputy Tony Castillo of the Orange County Sheriff's Department was in his cruiser, out on his usual rounds. Deputy Castillo eased off the gas when he noticed a silver Dodge Stratus car pulled over in the breakdown lane on a rural highway outside of San Juan Capistrano. It was pitch black and there wasn't much traffic. Castillo figured there wasn't a reason for anyone to stop right there unless they were having car trouble, so he decided he would walk over and see if they needed any help. Castillo pulled his cruiser in behind the car. He could see that the car's engine was still running and the high beam lights were on, and the passenger side door was wide open. Just ahead of the car on the side of the road, Castillo saw a pole with an emergency phone box attached to it. He thought maybe the passenger in this car had jumped out of the car after it pulled over to go use that call box to call for help, because maybe their car had broken down. But then Castillo noticed a woman's bare foot sticking out of that open passenger door, and he knew right then something had to be wrong. Castillo radioed to let dispatch know what he'd found and that he was now going to go investigate. Then Castillo got out of the cruiser, put his right hand on his holster, and began walking towards the back of the Dodge. Castillo's footsteps on the gravel were the only sound. Castillo saw what looked like a smear of blood on the back passenger side door. But he went around to the driver's side, and he saw right away the front window was smashed. And Castillo saw a scene of pure horror inside the car. A man was slumped over in the driver's seat, still wearing a seatbelt, and a woman who had been in the passenger seat was sprawled across the front seat, basically on the driver, with her head on the man's lap. Both of them had been shot multiple times, and they were drenched in blood, and when Castillo checked both of them for a pulse, he found they had none. They were both dead. Castillo rushed back to his cruiser, and he radioed dispatch to tell them that he had just walked up on 2 apparent homicide victims out on Ortega Highway. Then Castillo ran the plates on the Dodge Stratus, and the vehicle came back as being registered to Ken and Carolyn Stahl. And while he couldn't know for sure quite yet, Castillo was reasonably certain that those were the 2 victims. After getting Castillo's message, the sheriff's office assigned 2 veteran detectives, Joe Holmes and James McDonald, to lead the potential murder investigation. They arrived on the lonely stretch of road on Ortega Highway at about 1 a.m. The area was already alive, with crime scene technicians and sheriff's deputies gathering up evidence, photographing the victims, and just trying to make sense of the baffling scene. The deputies who were already at the scene informed Detectives Holmes and McDonald that the victims were indeed Ken and Carolyn Stahl. And based on the scene in the car, the deputies believed that Ken had been shot first and then Carolyn. Detective Holmes looked closely at the 2 bodies inside the car, and he thought the deputies were probably right. He thanked them for their help and then did an initial search of the car and the surrounding area. And honestly, Holmes was kind of impressed by how little physical evidence had been left behind at the scene. There were no footprints, no fingerprints, no skid marks, no bullet casings, and no weapon. Whoever did this had been very thorough, leaving law enforcement with almost nothing to work with. But then Holmes and McDonald did an extensive examination of the bloody interior of the car, and they began to discover some clues. Carolyn was covered in expensive jewelry, and the only piece that was missing was a single earring that had fallen on the ground. Likewise, Ken had plenty of cash and credit cards in his wallet, but nothing of value had been taken, so this didn't look like a robbery. The 2 detectives saw that both victims had been shot multiple times from outside the car. 1 bullet had gone through the driver's side door, and the others through the open window. So this could not be a traditional murder-suicide either. Somebody else had fired 8 to 12 bullets into Carolyn and Ken and then left them for dead. To Holmes and McDonald, this honestly looked like a mob hit, and the shootings had a depressing familiarity to McDonald. In his years as a detective, he had investigated multiple murders on this highway, Ortega Highway. There was the farmhand who was found buried in a shallow grave, and the dead man in the trunk of an abandoned car. McDonald sometimes thought that Ortega Highway was pretty much just a place for killers to dispose of bodies. But he just couldn't begin to understand how 2 middle-aged, very successful doctors from a wealthy gated community could wind up slaughtered in this desolate place. Word that Carolyn and Ken had been gunned down on a rural mountain road near San Juan Capistrano immediately dominated the news. The seemingly random quality of the shooting sent a shiver across the whole region of Southern California where Carolyn and Ken lived, and it left Ken and Carolyn's family and friends almost speechless. No one could imagine somebody hating the couple so much that they needed to kill them. The owner of the eye care clinic where Carolyn practiced joked that Carolyn was so kind they deliberately gave her the grumpiest patients because she could always cheer them up. And Ken's colleagues spoke equally highly of him. A doctor who had served on a state board with Ken said that he was revered by other doctors for his wise medical judgment. And friends also pointed out that the couple worked all the time, often 6 days a week. Ken provided anesthesia for surgeries at multiple medical facilities, so he had a complex, unpredictable schedule. And Carolyn was so devoted to her practice that she had previously canceled vacation plans to avoid inconveniencing her colleagues. So their friends wondered when they would even have time to have made enemies. And early on, investigators struggled with the same question. On December 4th, so 2 weeks after the murders, hundreds of mourners crowded into St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Huntington Beach, California. They cried together, they comforted each other, and they celebrated Carolyn and Ken's lives. Ken's 87-year-old mother made her way to the front of the crowd. She said she had always braced herself for the possibility that her son might die young because of his bad heart, but nothing had prepared her for her son's violent end. Then she broke down in tears and said all she wanted to do was hold her son one more time. In the days following the funeral, Detectives McDonald and Holmes still didn't have much encouraging news for Ken and Carolyn's families, but their investigative team was still very busy. At a separate memorial service held for Ken by his colleagues, deputies had asked all the attendees to sign in a guest book. They wanted to know who was there, and they wanted to compare handwriting samples to documents they had collected from where Ken and Carolyn lived and worked to see if they could find anything connecting Ken's colleagues to the killings. But after a few weeks into the investigation, Holmes and McDonald still didn't have a suspect in mind, but they were getting a better picture of the killer. The autopsy confirmed that both Carolyn and Ken had been killed by multiple gunshots sometime between the hours of 8:30 p.m. and 10 p.m., so not long before Deputy Castillo had found the car. Also, a separate ballistics analysis found that all the gunshots came from a single gun, most likely a .357 Magnum revolver. That gave Holmes and McDonald a couple of key pieces of information. First, Ken and Carolyn were most likely murdered by a single gunman. And second, the killer was cold and collected. They had fired at least 8 shots from a revolver that held only 6 bullets, meaning the shooter had to stop in the middle of the murders, reload their weapon, and start firing again. Those reports forced Holmes and McDonald to think about the last minutes of Carolyn's life. Her husband was dead, and she was all alone in a cold, dark, strange place. Meanwhile, her killer was casually reloading their gun so they could shoot more bullets into her. I mean, this was a truly awful way to go. And that information pushed the detectives to dig even deeper into Carolyn and Ken's lives in the hope they would find something that would lead them to the killer. And in doing this deep dive, Holmes and McDonald soon discovered that Carolyn and Ken's 14-year marriage was not nearly as perfect as some of their grieving friends and relatives had thought. Some of the couple's loved ones had come forward and told the detectives that Carolyn and Ken had problems, a lot of problems. Carolyn's sister Linda actually reached out and asked to meet with the detectives. She said she didn't want to speak ill of the dead, but she really needed them to know the truth. And so, on a cool December day, Linda arrived at the sheriff's station, and she followed Holmes and McDonald into a small, comfortable office. And within a few seconds of sitting down, Linda went on an absolute tirade about her brother-in-law, Ken. She told the detectives that Ken had a history of cheating that began way before he even met Carolyn. Ken's first marriage had ended because Ken had an affair. Then Ken had married the woman he had the affair with, but that marriage also fell apart within just 3 months. Linda said her sister Carolyn was well aware of Ken's romantic history when she had moved in with him back in 1984. But Carolyn was determined to make a better man of him. And after they had been living together for a year, Carolyn gave Ken an ultimatum: marry her, or the relationship would be over. Ken had told friends he never wanted to get married again, but he reluctantly gave in to Carolyn's demand. Linda said their marriage actually seemed to go pretty smoothly for a while. Carolyn was close with Ken's mother, and she was also close with Ken's son from his first marriage, and with 2 doctors' incomes, they made a ton of money, and so their future looked quite bright. Suddenly, Linda trailed off and just stopped talking. The detectives asked her if she needed a break, or if they could get her anything, but she said she did want to keep going. She needed to get this all out. Then Linda took a deep breath and composed herself, and told the detectives that things had taken a really bad turn for her sister about 5 years earlier. She said Carolyn had come home from visiting family in Michigan, and she found a woman she didn't know eating fast food on the couch in her living room. The woman was just as surprised as Carolyn, and she fled the house immediately, but Ken had admitted he was romantically involved with that woman. Linda said she had hoped her sister would just leave Ken right then and there, but she didn't. Instead of demanding a divorce, Carolyn had demanded marriage counseling. But even with marriage counseling, Ken's behavior didn't change. He had at least 3 more affairs that Linda said she was aware of, and she said his address book was still full of women's names and phone numbers. Linda clutched the arms of her chair tight, and she fought back tears while she talked about her sister. But she took a deep breath and continued her story. She told the detectives that she had been so angry at Ken that she finally confronted him about his chronic cheating and about how much he was hurting her sister. One of the detectives asked how Ken responded to that, and Linda gave a slight laugh and shook her head, and then she said Ken had just shrugged his shoulders and told her that, he was the person he was, and Carolyn just had to accept that. Finally, Linda told the detectives that Carolyn went to great lengths to hide the ugly truth about her marriage. Carolyn was always very careful to give the impression of marital bliss to friends and coworkers. She would even buy herself her own Christmas presents. She would wrap them and put tags on them that said they were from Ken, even though obviously they were not, and she would put them under the tree, and so that when friends and family came over, they would see how good Ken was being to his wife. And Ken just played along with this for the sake of appearances. Linda said one of the reasons Carolyn was buying all these gifts for herself is because she believed buying nice things for herself made her happy. She called it retail therapy. But Linda knew her sister better than anybody, and she knew no matter what Carolyn did, no matter what she bought, no matter how nice it was, nothing could change the fact that Ken had totally broken her heart. The detectives shared a look. Linda's retail therapy comment had just potentially cleared up a question they'd had for weeks. When they had searched Carolyn and Ken's home right after the murders, they found nearly $30,000 in brand new women's clothing and accessories. A lot of it was actually still wrapped in plastic, with the price tags still attached. That had really confused the detectives at the time, but now it kind of made sense. The detectives thanked Linda for all her help, and then they walked her out of the station. McDonald and Holmes hadn't let on in front of her, but Linda's revelations about Ken and Carolyn's troubled relationship opened up a world of potential murder suspects. Did a former girlfriend take revenge on Ken for leaving her? Or did a jealous husband of one of the women that Ken had an affair with lash out? There was even a chance that Ken had been the lone target of one of those jilted lovers or angry husbands, and Carolyn had just happened to be with him at the time of the murder. With this new information, the detectives now wanted to dig into all of Ken's communications with all the women he was potentially having affairs with. Like most doctors in the 1990s, Ken carried a pager, which is a small electronic device that buzzes and gives a phone number to call when somebody needs you. The detectives got Ken's pager, and they contacted every phone number on it. This at least allowed them to reconstruct key parts of Ken's last day. The detectives found a fellow anesthesiologist who paged Ken around 8 p.m. on the night of the murder. This other anesthesiologist had hoped that Ken could cover for him at a surgery the next morning. The doctor said Ken sounded normal when they talked, and that Ken was out celebrating his wife's birthday. So McDonald and Holmes reasoned that whatever happened to the couple that night probably caught them completely by surprise. McDonald also came across a Mexican immigrant named Adriana Vasco who had paged Ken on the morning of the murders. She explained that she had become friends with Ken several years earlier when she worked in the office at the National Pain Institute where he was a part-time anesthesiologist. Adriana said that Ken had agreed to get her desktop computer repaired, and she had paged him to find out how the repairs were going. McDonald was immediately suspicious of this. He couldn't understand why a busy doctor would be volunteering to repair computers on the side. The detective asked Adriana flat out if she was having an affair with Ken, but she denied it. Adriana insisted that Ken was just a very generous guy. He had helped her out financially numerous times over the years. The call with Adriana lasted only 5 minutes, but McDonald came away from it with the distinct sense that he had just been lied to. But he had no evidence to back up his gut feeling, so he let it drop, at least for the moment. Over the coming days, McDonald and Holmes repeatedly asked Ken's family and friends what they knew about Adriana Vasco. The detectives got nothing but blank stares. None of the friends or family had ever heard of her. Then, in late December, a woman contacted the detectives and admitted right at the start that she'd had an affair with Ken in the mid-1990s. And when she heard about the murders, she'd recalled a conversation she'd had with Ken back then. She said Ken had complained that he was being blackmailed by someone close to him and that he was not in control of his own life. The woman's story was chilling, and blackmail was not out of the realm of possibility. After all, Ken had had multiple affairs, and most people assumed he was rich because he was a doctor. But the detectives had also discovered that Ken's health issues had caused him to miss months of work in the past. that had led to some financial strain and had forced Ken and Carolyn to move out of their $700,000 home into the comfortable but much more modest condo where they had lived at the time of their deaths. The detectives also knew Carolyn had spent at least $30,000 on clothes and jewelry for herself. So now Holmes and McDonald wondered if the murders simply came down to money. Maybe Ken couldn't pay someone who was blackmailing him, so they killed him and his wife. But as 1999 came to an end, the detectives still had no major suspects. They had followed a bunch of different leads, but so far, nothing had paid off. However, both detectives had a strong feeling that cracking this case would begin with one of the women Ken had an affair with, and they thought that woman could be Adriana Vasco. Both detectives were confident she knew a lot more than she had told them, so it was time to have another conversation. On February 29, 2000, so over 3 months after the murders, detectives McDonald and Holmes met Adriana Vasco at her friend's house in Anaheim, California. Adriana was little, she was barely 5 feet tall, and she was quite thin. She was 33 years old and a single mother of 2 young kids. Over coffee at her kitchen table, Adriana told the detectives how she had become friends with Ken, a man who seemed to live in a completely different world than she did. She explained that Ken had noticed her walking with a limp when they were both working at the National Pain Institute. Ken had offered to inject pain medication into her back to correct the limp, but he told her it would be an ongoing procedure. At the kitchen table, Adriana took a sip of her coffee, and then a smile came across her face. She said she had agreed to the procedure, and as the pain injections continued, the two of them started getting a bit closer. Adriana said she had even begun calling him Ken instead of Dr. Stahl, and Ken had clearly taken a growing interest in Adriana's life. Then, when Adriana had split with her husband, Ken paid for her and her son to go live in a motel. When Adriana's car had broken down, Ken gave her money to buy a new one, a white Mazda. So Adriana told the detectives it became normal for her to turn to Ken for help because he was always so kind to her. And Adriana said that in return, she became a shoulder for Ken to cry on. He opened up to her about his unhappiness. He told her he hated the Orange County doctor's life. He thought it was totally phony. He said he had a lot more fun when he went to the beer and barbecue chicken restaurant, which was down the street from Adriana's apartment. Ken had even told Adriana at one point that she was his only real friend. Detectives McDonald and Holmes sat on the edge of their seats, wanting to ask Adriana again if she was actually romantically involved with Ken, but they held their tongues and just let her talk. Adriana continued and said that Ken's marriage had been empty for years. He complained about his wife's looks and her weight, and he said they mostly slept in separate bedrooms. Then Adriana began to cry. She apologized and said she was still in shock over Ken's death. She said when she found out he died, it was like her whole world had just collapsed. Ken was like her hero. Finally, after Adriana wiped the tears from her face, she looked across the table at the detectives and she admitted that she had had an affair with Ken. And Ken's wife, Carolyn, knew about it. She told the detectives that about 3.5 years earlier, she had received a phone call from Ken, but the moment she answered, Ken quickly handed the phone off to his wife, Carolyn, and Carolyn's message to Adriana was blunt: "Stay away from my husband." Adriana said she broke off the affair soon after getting that phone call. She knew Ken would never divorce his wife, and she didn't want to get hurt. But she and Ken had remained friends even when Adriana found a new romantic partner and even had a daughter with him. In fact, Adriana said that Ken would sometimes go out to dinner with Adriana's new guy. Also, Adriana said after they split up, Ken never tried to have sex with her again. And she told the detectives that she really believed that Ken and Carolyn had genuinely started to work on their marriage at the time they got killed. And when she had spoken to Ken on the day he was killed, Adriana said he sounded happier than he had in months. McDonald and Holmes had more questions for Adriana, but the coffees were long since cold and it was after 5 p.m., so they thanked her for her time and they headed for the door. By the summer of 2000, the sensational double murder that had once gotten so much media attention was increasingly in danger of going cold. McDonald and Holmes had come away from their interview with Adriana convinced that her grief over Ken's death was actually sincere. She was probably lying about the length of their affair, but the detectives couldn't see why Adriana would want Ken dead. He had been a ready source of money and support to her for years. So the hope that one of Ken's lovers would lead them to the truth about the murders began to fade, and the detectives hadn't found any evidence that Ken had been blackmailed by anybody. Holmes and McDonald continued to pursue every possible lead, and they re-interviewed anyone who seemed to be remotely connected to the case, but their investigation stalled. In the fall of 2000, about 10 months after the murders, McDonald and Holmes were reassigned to another unit, and two new detectives, Brian Heaney and Phil Villalobos, took over Carolyn and Ken's murder case. Initially, the two new detectives felt totally overwhelmed. Villalobos had only been a homicide detective for 2 weeks, and Heaney's experience was mostly just in narcotics. But as they began to dig through the huge case file, they realized that their predecessors, McDonald and Holmes, were likely overwhelmed too. But something caught Detective Villalobos' eye as he reviewed Ken's cell phone records from the day of his death. Ken had called the same number 4 times, and the calls were to the same person who had paged Ken on the morning of the murders, Adriana Vasco. So Villalobos and Heaney quickly decided to pick up where the previous detectives had left off, and they turned their focus to Adriana. And at 8 p.m. on October 11th, almost 11 months after the murders, Adriana arrived at the sheriff's station for another interview. But this time, she was not eager to help. Adriana insisted that on the day of Ken's murder, she had only contacted him to talk about those computer repairs, and that the conversation was so innocuous that she couldn't even remember anything else they talked about. The two detectives pressed Adriana hard to get her to say more. Villalobos even asked her straight out who killed Ken. But Adriana broke into tears and said she had no idea and genuinely could not remember anything substantive from their last conversation. The detectives would question Adriana really aggressively for several hours until finally it was clear she just didn't have anything else to say, so they let her go. But the detectives were not quite finished with Adriana. After she left, the detectives rushed outside after her and hopped in their car and followed her. After driving for several minutes, Adriana arrived at a house where the father of one of her children was waiting for her. Adriana and this man had split up, but they remained close for the sake of their daughter. The detectives watched Adriana with this man from a distance, and they began to develop a new theory. Maybe Adriana did have nothing to do with Ken's death, but maybe this man who she was with, the father of her daughter, had gotten jealous of her affair with Ken, and maybe he lashed out. And so now maybe Adriana was doing everything she could to protect him, really just so her young daughter would not be without her father. Villalobos and Heaney waited for Adriana to leave, and then after she had, they hopped out of their car, walked up to the front door, knocked, and then when the man came to the door, they led him to the front yard to question him. And to the detective's surprise, this man was completely open and asked how he could help. Villalobos told him that he was convinced someone close to Adriana had killed Ken and Carolyn Stahl, but the detectives didn't know who. The man said that made sense to him, and he understood why they would want to question him, but then this man said something that sent Villalobos and Heaney reeling. He told them that he had nothing to do with Carolyn and Ken's murders, but he had a pretty good idea of who probably killed them. Villalobos just stared at him and then asked him outright, okay, who's the killer? And the man would say one word, Tony. The detectives were caught off guard. In all those files from nearly a year-long investigation, the name Tony had never once come up. Now they had someone telling them a guy named Tony was probably the killer they had been looking for. The detectives followed up with a bunch more questions about who this Tony person was, and they would learn that Tony was Adriana's current boyfriend, and he was a handyman at her apartment building. He also had a long criminal rap sheet, he had a temper, and he loved guns. A few days later, Detective Heaney was waiting in an unmarked car outside the hospital where Adriana worked. Investigators had been trying to track down Adriana's boyfriend, Tony, but the man seemed to have disappeared. So Heaney wanted Adriana to help them find him. Eventually, Adriana walked outside, still dressed in her scrubs, and right away Heaney rushed up to her and caught her completely by surprise. He asked her point blank if she would take a polygraph test right now. He said the test was all set up at the local police station right around the corner. All she had to do was come with him. Adriana was clearly shocked and pretty angry with Heaney for surprising her like this, but she did go with him to the police station. During the polygraph test, Adriana faced round after round of very difficult questions from Heaney and Villalobos, and Adriana held her ground, denying any knowledge of the murders. But then, Heaney hit her with a surprise question. He asked if Tony was the killer. She tried to deny knowing Tony, but it was already too late. The detectives knew he was her boyfriend and that she was lying to them. So Heaney began asking rapid-fire questions about Tony. Where was he? Did he know Ken? But Adriana collected herself, and she insisted she had no answers for them. But the detectives were convinced Adriana was now the key to unlocking this case, and too many people had been working for too long on this investigation to let this opportunity slip away. And it turned out the detectives had one more surprise for Adriana. There was an outstanding warrant for her arrest for driving with a suspended license, and they were going to use that to lock her up for the night. Adriana begged to be allowed to go home to her kids, but the detectives handcuffed her and led her to a cell. Now they just had to find Tony. Even after being locked up, Adriana did not tell the detectives where her boyfriend Tony was. But her phone bill showed that she had repeatedly called a number in Greenville, North Carolina over the past couple of days, and Detective Villalobos had a hunch that those were calls to Tony. Villalobos sent a picture of Tony to local police in Greenville, and right away an officer in Greenville contacted him and said he recognized Tony. He told Villalobos that Tony actually went by the name Dennis Godley in Greenville, but the local cops just called him the Weasel because he was so good at eluding arrest. However, the officer in Greenville said he would still be able to lead Villalobos and his partner right to Tony. So Detectives Villalobos and Heaney headed right to the airport and took a flight from California to North Carolina. And while they were there, they did meet and interview Tony. However, he was totally uncooperative. He claimed that he had never been close to Adriana and that he had absolutely no role in the death of Ken and Carolyn Stahl. The detectives flew home feeling frustrated and with almost no new information, but their plan with Adriana had worked. After spending the night in jail and worrying she would not get to go home to her kids, she was now finally ready to tell the detectives everything she knew about Tony and everything she knew about Ken and Carolyn's murders. And by the time Adriana was finished talking, Detectives Villalobos and Heaney were ready to make arrests in a case that had now gone on for almost a year. Based on Adriana's jail cell interview and evidence collected by both teams of detectives throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Carolyn and Ken Stahl out on Ortega Highway on November 20th, 1999. On that November day, the killer sat in the passenger seat of a parked car not far from the restaurant in San Juan Capistrano, where Ken and Carolyn were celebrating Carolyn's birthday. The killer calmly loaded their .357 Magnum and made small talk with the driver. But the driver wasn't listening. They had their eyes focused on the road right outside of the restaurant. Then the driver suddenly told the killer to be quiet. Ken's Dodge Stratus had just pulled out onto the road. The driver waited to let Ken's car get a little further away. Then the driver started their car, pulled out onto the road, and followed Ken. The driver tracked Ken onto Ortega Highway. The highway was dark and oddly quiet. The driver gripped the steering wheel tight and closed in on Ken. Meanwhile, the killer just kept talking like nothing out of the ordinary was even happening. Then at some point, Ken's car pulled off the highway into the breakdown lane near an emergency phone box. The driver told the killer it was time to act. Then the driver hit the gas, raced by Ken's car, and then did a U-turn into the breakdown lane. The driver's headlights were now shining directly into Ken's windshield. The driver put the car in park, and then the killer casually stepped out of the car. The killer walked right up to the driver's side window and tapped on the glass, and Ken rolled the window down. Ken was about to say something when the killer casually raised the .357 Magnum and fired. The bullet hit Ken behind the left ear and exited through his right eye. Carolyn began to scream from the passenger seat and tried to undo her seatbelt, but she was in shock and her hands were shaking, and so she couldn't get free. The killer then fired another shot into Ken, and this time the bullet shredded his aorta, the body's main artery. And so blood sprayed all over the car, and Ken slumped over, dead. Carolyn finally got her seatbelt off, but by this point, the killer stuck his gun through the open driver's side window and fired multiple shots point blank at Carolyn, hitting Carolyn in the chest. Carolyn screamed again and blood began to pour down her shirt, but she was still alive. So the killer aimed the gun at her and fired again, but they were out of bullets. So as Carolyn is sitting there slowly dying and screaming and looking at her dead husband, the killer walked back to the other car. They opened up the passenger side door, shouted something at the driver, and then grabbed extra ammunition from a bag on the floor. Then the killer calmly reloaded their gun and then turned back and began walking towards Ken's car again. By this point, the killer saw the passenger side door of the Dodge Stratus was now open. Carolyn tumbled out of the car and one of her earrings fell to the ground. She was covered in blood and struggling to breathe, but she managed to brace herself against the back door of the car and stay on her feet. Carolyn looked around for any kind of escape route, but then she heard something behind her. She turned and saw the killer walking towards her with their gun raised. There was nowhere to go. In a last, desperate attempt to save herself, Carolyn dove back inside the car head first. One of her red shoes fell off as she struggled to pull herself across the front seat of the car over the body of her dead husband. She was trying to get to the driver's side so that maybe she could speed away and save herself. But the killer just walked to the open passenger door, aimed their gun at the back of Carolyn's head, and fired off 2 more shots. Carolyn fell over dead in Ken's lap. The killer leaned in to make sure both Ken and Carolyn were dead. Then they did a thorough sweep of the car and the road around it to make sure they picked up any stray evidence, like bullet casings. Finally, when the killer was satisfied, they walked back to the white Mazda that was still parked with its lights shining directly into Ken's car. Then the killer got back into the Mazda and looked over at the driver. And the driver was shaking and horrified. The killer told the driver to calm down and just get out of here. But the driver shouted at the killer that they were not supposed to kill Ken. The driver said she loved Ken, and Ken was actually the one who had paid them to murder his wife. It would turn out Adriana was the driver, and her boyfriend, Tony, had indeed pulled the trigger and killed Carolyn and Ken. But Ken had actually been the one who set the entire thing in motion. It turned out Ken had wanted his wife dead for a long time. He wanted to be free to have relationships with lots of women without any repercussions and just to live his life however he wanted. But Ken felt like he was reliant on Carolyn. She took care of him and she made a lot of money, so if his health issues kept him from working again, he would still be able to live well because of Carolyn. Ken went so far as to tell some people that Carolyn had control of his life, and it was like he was being blackmailed just to stay in the marriage, even though that was just not true. But finally, Ken told Adriana that he had just had enough, and he asked her to help him murder his wife. Adriana said her boyfriend Tony would be perfect for the job. He was good with guns and calm in any situation. So Ken paid Adriana and Tony $30,000 to carry out a hit on Carolyn. And Ken and Adriana hammered out all of the details, including the exact location on Ortega Highway where Ken would pull over and the murder would go down. On the day of the murder, Ken had contacted Adriana multiple times to let her know when he and Carolyn were heading to the restaurant, and then when they arrived, and then also when they were leaving. And Adriana and Tony had been waiting nearby to follow him to the spot they'd agreed on. But when it came time to actually do the job, Tony took things into his own hands. He didn't trust Ken, and he didn't want the middle-aged doctor around to pin the whole thing on him. So Tony decided to just kill Ken too. Carolyn was truly just an innocent victim. Her husband had plotted against her and had even tried to paint her as some kind of blackmailing monster. But Carolyn's friends and family knew that despite all of Ken's cheating, Carolyn still loved him, and she still believed they could repair their marriage. But Ken had no intention of doing that. At trial, Adriana insisted that she tried to talk Ken out of going through with the shooting, and that she ultimately only went along with it because she was afraid of Tony. But ultimately, a jury would convict her of masterminding the entire murder plot and sentenced her to life in prison without parole. As for Tony, he would ultimately plead guilty to the murders in exchange for a life sentence instead of the death penalty. And Tony would insist to the very end that Adriana was the one who shot Carolyn, not him. In the fall of 2002, 19-year-old Gemma Houghton moved into her dorm room at the very prestigious University of Manchester in England to begin her freshman year. Her first couple of months at the school were relatively uneventful. She spent all of her time focusing on her studies, and so she really had not gone out and met any new people. But in early 2003, so about halfway through her freshman year, she was standing outside of her dorm when this boy she had never met before walked up to her and introduced himself. He was this tall, very handsome, very charming guy. He said his name was Ian Redmond. He was a senior at the school, and he in fact lived in the same building that she did, and so he just wanted to introduce himself. Now, Gemma was not looking for a boyfriend, but she was immediately attracted to Ian, and Ian would later say the feeling was mutual. This chance encounter would ultimately blossom into a full-fledged romantic relationship, one that would ultimately lead to Ian 6 years later proposing to Gemma on Christmas Eve 2009. That same year, they got engaged. The couple, who had diligently saved money for years and years and years, were able to pool their money and buy a house together. It was not a very nice house. It was a fairly beat-up cottage in this little town in England that would need a lot of work, but Ian and Gemma were actually very excited to do the work. They looked at this as an opportunity to make the house exactly the way they wanted it, and it was a chance for them to spend some quality time together. So for the next 2 years, during all of their free time, Ian and Gemma would work on their home, and then finally in August of 2011, right before their actual wedding day, they finished the renovation. Their home is done. And so they get married, and then literally right after their wedding, instead of going right into a honeymoon, they just moved right into their dream home that night. And so for the next couple of days, the newlyweds got to enjoy being husband and wife for the first time inside of their dream home, and then it was time to go on the honeymoon. In addition to having set aside money for the down payment on their home, the couple had also set aside money for this honeymoon. They wanted it to be an amazing vacation. And so what they decided to do for their honeymoon was to go to Seychelles, which is this island nation in the Indian Ocean, which many say has the most beautiful beaches in the world. So on August 10th, the couple hops on a plane and they fly to Seychelles. And when they land, they check into their resort, which is this unbelievable place that overlooks this perfect beach with white sand and crystal clear waters. And then after getting checked in, the couple goes down to a restaurant and they're having a bite to eat. And as they're sitting there, they're probably thinking to themselves, this is going to be the best vacation ever. During the first week of their trip, the couple was very active, spending lots of time exploring the island and going out on different excursions and going to lots of restaurants. They were just all over the place. And so come Tuesday, August 16th, which was the start of their second week and final week of this honeymoon, the couple was kind of tired from all the activity. And so they decided they would just have a lazy day at the beach that day. And so the couple grabbed their swimsuits and their towels and their chairs, and they left the resort and headed down to the beach right outside. And then after finding a decent spot on the sand, they set up their chairs and towels, put their stuff down, and Gemma, she laid down on one of the chairs to begin sunbathing, and Ian, he grabbed his fins and his snorkel, and he kissed Gemma on the cheek and said he was going to go down to the water and go for a swim. Gemma remembers watching Ian as he walked across the beach and stopped in front of the water and put on his big fins and got his snorkel on, and then he kind of awkwardly duck walked his way into the water. And Gemma remembers just smiling and laughing to herself, watching him awkwardly do this, and then thinking to herself how lucky she was to be married to such an amazing guy. She really loved him so much. After Ian had finally gotten into the water and had begun his snorkeling journey, Gemma laid back and began to doze off to sleep. A little while later, though, Gemma suddenly woke up to the sound of what almost sounded like someone sneezing really, really loudly. And so instinctively, she sat up and scanned the waterline for her husband, but all she saw were other tourists in the water swimming and snorkeling and doing all sorts of stuff. She couldn't find Ian. And then she heard a male voice calling out for help, and it was coming off to the right towards the top of the beach, pretty far away from her. And she turned and she saw Ian. Ian was about 60 feet off of the sand, so he's well out into the water, and he appeared to be kind of hunched forward with his arm kind of in the water, and he's waving his other arm in the air. It was like he was stuck on something, and before Gemma could get up and run to him or help him in any way, Ian just begins to scream at the top of his lungs. When Ian began screaming, there was a surgeon who was also on vacation at this beach, who was in a boat near where Ian was. He hears the scream and he boats over to Ian, and he and the guy who was in the boat with him managed to pull Ian out of the water. They get him on the boat, and Ian is alive and he's conscious, but he is missing his entire left arm. He's missing the majority of his left thigh, and there was a huge chunk missing from his midsection. It would turn out Ian had been attacked by a bull shark, one of the most aggressive sharks in the world. That sneezing sound that Gemma had heard that had startled her awake was the sound Ian had made through his snorkel when the shark bit down on him. The surgeon rushed Ian to the shore and pulled him out and got him onto the sand and began trying to save his life. At the same time, Gemma had come running up the beach, and she managed to push through the quickly forming crowd, and she drops down next to her husband. And Ian at this point is alive and he's conscious. He's very badly hurt, but he's looking up and he's clearly making eye contact with Gemma. And Gemma, she's looking down at her husband and she's making clear eye contact with him, and they don't really say much. It was like this horrible moment where all they could do was just be in the moment together. And so during this kind of silent acknowledgement, Ian would ultimately pass away. It would turn out, over the past few weeks, there had been a rash of shark attacks at this beach, including one other fatal attack on another tourist. Because shark attacks in Seychelles were so unheard of, they believed this had to be the work of one rogue bull shark. That was the one shark that was doing all of these attacks. And so because this shark had not been captured or killed, the country had actually instituted a temporary ban on swimming at this beach and a few other beaches. But for whatever reason, the ban had not been communicated effectively to the tourists, nor had it been enforced on the tourists. And so Gemma and Ian had no idea the water was a dangerous place to be. They just looked out and saw other tourists swimming around and believed it was totally safe, when in reality, it obviously wasn't. Gemma would quickly return to England, and she would host her husband's funeral in the same church she and he had been married in 10 days earlier. Before we get into our next story, I want to talk about today's sponsor, Current. Have you ever felt like everyone around you has a weirdly deep understanding of their personal finances? They're investing in the stock market, they have 401ks and Roth IRAs, they're buying up crypto and NFTs and Ethereum, they got all this stuff going on, and you're like, I have a bank account? If that's you, then you're like me. And if you're like me, you really need to sign up for Current. Imagine a company that could drastically simplify your personal finances. They could help you save money, they could earn you points on your purchases, and on top of that, they have a very slick mobile app. Well, the company you're thinking of would be Current. They are not only designed for the not financial gurus like myself, they are also designed for the future. Right now, virtually every bank requires you, at least at some point, to come into their physical location, despite the fact we're in 2021, about to go into 2022, where everything is online, but banks have not evolved. Current, on the other hand, they have evolved. Their entire operation is online. Once you sign up, they fire you off one of these sweet little debit cards, but then everything else is done on their app. Current and I are also giving away $10,000 to you all. All you gotta do is sign up for Current using my promo code BALLEN, and then you could be one of 20 people who wins $500. So go sign up now. Okay, back to the stories. In 1986, 35 million Americans went to see the brand new movie Crocodile Dundee, which was a comedy that starred this very capable and rugged Australian crocodile hunter who goes to New York City. One of the 35 million Americans who saw this film was a 24-year-old model from Virginia named Ginger Meadows. And after seeing this film, Ginger felt inspired to actually go to Australia to see it for herself because it looked so amazing in this movie. So a couple of months later, in March of 1987, Ginger, by herself, hops on a plane and flies to Perth, which is a major city in Western Australia. And her plan was she would land in Australia and then work odd jobs to make a little bit of cash, and then use that cash to fund her travels all over the country. And then at some point, after she was tired of doing that, she would head back to the United States. So she lands in Perth, and immediately she sees her first opportunity to make some money. There had been this huge sailing competition in the city day leading up to the weekend she arrived there. And so she saw all these luxury yachts anchored at all these docks along the coastline. And Ginger's thinking to herself, these huge ships, they have crews that work on them basically full time. Maybe one of these boats could use an extra set of hands. And so Ginger, who was very friendly and outgoing, she went right down to one of these docks and she stopped in front of the very first yacht she saw, which was this huge luxury 100-foot yacht. And she introduced herself to the captain of this boat. And she said, hey, can I hitch a ride with you guys to the next place you're going? And in exchange, I'll work for you. And as it happened, the captain was actually looking for another crew member to assist their chef. And so he said, okay, well, can you cook? And Ginger said, yeah, I'm a great cook. And he said, okay, well, you're hired. You can be the chef's assistant. And so Ginger, she climbs on board and she meets the rest of the 5 other crew members, including the chef who she'd be working with. And the chef's name was Jane, and those two would become very close. And then shortly after Ginger had come aboard, the captain cast off their lines and they headed out to sea. Their next stop was going to be New Guinea, which was roughly 14 days of travel away. After about a week at sea, the captain realized they were dangerously low on fresh water. And so he decided to take a detour and turn east and head inland along this river system that would bring them to this large freshwater pool, which he also knew had this huge waterfall that dumped down into it. And so he figured they could go right underneath this waterfall and fill up their jugs with all this fresh water and then head back out and they'd be good. So on the morning of March 29th, the captain anchored the yacht out at sea near the mouth of this river system, and then he lowered the yacht's dinghy, which was a smaller, more agile boat. And once that was in the water, he, Ginger, Jane, and the rest of the crew, they hop in this dinghy along with all these large empty water jugs, and they begin making their way towards this river. And so they're traveling up this river for a little while, and then finally they get to this huge freshwater pool, and right in front of them is this amazing waterfall, and everybody is just totally awestruck by this waterfall. It's like a gem in the middle of nowhere, because they're in very rugged Australia at this point. And so the captain, he brings the dinghy right near the base of the waterfall, and one by one they hold up their water jugs and they fill them with fresh water, and then they're about to turn and go back out to sea and get back on their yacht when the captain thinks to himself, you know what, we've been at sea for 7 days straight, it's been very monotonous, maybe it would be a good thing to stick around here for a little bit longer and maybe even hike up to the top of this waterfall and enjoy the view and kind of enjoy the scenery before we head back out to sea. And so he says to his crew, hey, do you guys want to go to the top of this waterfall? And everyone agrees it's a great idea, with the exception of Jane. She did not feel like hiking to the top of this waterfall. She said she would stay down in the dinghy and wait for them. Now, this pool is basically surrounded on all sides by just pure cliff face. There really is no place to land this dinghy. There's no flat surfaces. You basically have cliffs that go directly into water, and then also you have the river that feeds back out to the ocean. So the captain brings the dinghy right up against the cliff face right next to this waterfall, and he and Ginger and the other crew members not named Jane climb out of the dinghy onto this cliff face, and they begin climbing, literally climbing up this wall towards the top of the waterfall. Now, everyone was able to do it except for Ginger. She kept slipping on the rocks. It was very steep. It seemed kind of dangerous. And so at some point, she abandons the idea and goes back down to the dinghy with Jane, and the captain and the rest of the crew, they continue up towards the top. And so as Ginger and Jane are sitting in the dinghy watching the other crew members making their way up, they start feeling a little bit left out, and they're like, you know what? Let's try to find an alternate way up to the top of this waterfall. And so they begin scanning out across this pool at the other cliffs kind of surrounding it, and it looked like on the very other side of the pool, there was a less severe cliff face that maybe they would have an easier time climbing up. And so the two women, they jump into the murky brown water and begin swimming directly across this pool towards this other cliff. And when they make it about a third of the way, Jane suddenly stops, and Ginger notices and turns around and looks at Jane, and she's like, what's going on? And Jane would tell her, you know, something just feels off. This doesn't feel right. Let's go back to the dinghy. Let's just forget about this. But Ginger is like, come on, we're so close. Let's just keep going. It'll be awesome once we get to the top of this waterfall. And so Jane, she's totally hesitant, but she says, okay, fine. And they both continue to swim. And then all of a sudden, they hear their captain, who is now on top of the waterfall, screaming down to them to get out of the water right now. And they notice he is pointing pointing down at the pool in a direction slightly away from where they were. And so they're looking up at him and they're following his finger down to the part of the pool he's pointing at, and they see there is this tidal wave of water coming towards them. It is a 12-foot-long saltwater crocodile that has noticed them, and it is charging straight at them. Now, Jane and Ginger knew they were too far away from the dinghy to be able to swim to it before this crocodile was going to reach them, and so their next best choice was just to turn and swim towards the nearest cliff face, because again, there is no place to get out of the water. There's only cliffs. And so they swim towards this cliff face, which is right on the edge of the bottom of the waterfall, and so water is landing on them, and they reach the cliff face, and they're trying to climb up and pull themselves out of the water, but there's nowhere to grab onto. It's all totally slick. There's no good handholds, and so all they have is this little ledge that is in the water that they're standing on, but they're still halfway into the water. And so after they struggle for a minute trying to pull themselves out of the water and they realize they can't do it, they both just turn around and they lock arms and they look out through the water that's falling down in front of them into the pool, and they see this crocodile has followed them, and it is now stopped right on the other side of the water that's falling down, and it's just staring at them with its mouth wide open. And the two women are looking at it. They don't know what to do. And the captain and the other crew members, they see what's going on, and they're trying to climb down as fast as they possibly can to try to rescue them. But it's going to take several minutes at least before they get down to the dinghy. And so Jane and Ginger, they're totally aware of this, and they're just staring at this crocodile, screaming at it, trying to get it to go away. And at some point, the crocodile does just close its mouth and sink below the surface. But now they don't know where it is, and this causes Ginger to completely panic, and she lets go of Jane's arm, and she dives into the water off to the right and attempts to swim away from the crocodile back over to the boat. But Ginger only made it 2 strokes before the crocodile suddenly re-emerged underneath her and grabbed her by the waist and pulled her under the water. Jane is just standing there watching all of this happen in front of her. She has no idea what to do. The crew is still not down in the dinghy, so she's totally stranded, and she's just staring at the area where Ginger has been pulled below the surface. And just seconds after she's been pulled under, the crocodile re-emerges with its head pointed towards Jane, and in its jaws is Ginger. And Ginger's got her arms up over her head. She's wide-eyed, and she's looking right at Jane. And Jane makes eye contact with her, but there's nothing she can do. And she just watched as Ginger again was pulled back under, and this time she did not come up again. Ultimately, Jane would be rescued from the ledge. The crew would get down to the dinghy, they'd swing over, they would pick her up, and then about 2 days later, they would find what was left of Ginger's remains. It would turn out the captain was well aware of the threat the crocodiles posed in this river, and he had told his crew, Ginger and Jane included, about this threat, and that at no point should anyone get in this water. But of course, his warning went unheeded. If you Google the words Burning Man and you click on images, you'll see lots of scantily clad and somewhat wild-looking people roaming around the Nevada desert on strange-looking bikes, and in the background, you'll see all these huge, bizarre statues of aliens and robots and animals, and these statues are often draped in more wild-looking people, or these statues are on fire, and these wild-looking people are dancing and rejoicing all around the flames. Based on these images, you might think Burning Man is just some totally weird substance-fueled party out in the middle of the desert. And while that is true to some degree, it's not totally accurate. Burning Man is not a party. It's actually an experiment that 70,000 people from all over the world participate in every year. The question this experiment is trying to answer is, can a random segment of the population come together and build a community out of nothing in the middle of nowhere? And can they do it while knowing at the end of Burning Man, which is always 9 days long, everything they build, the sculptures, the shelters, everything will be torn down and destroyed and erased from the planet as if it had never been there in the first place. And amazingly, year after year after year, the answer to this question is yes. Yes, they can. As soon as these 70,000 people descend on this small section of the Nevada desert, they immediately get to work helping each other, building their own sites. I mean, these people largely don't know each other, or in many cases, they don't even speak the same language, but they're showing up with this shared desire to build this temporary community. And so they begin seamlessly working together. And while shelters are being stood up all over the place, other attendees will pull out instruments and form impromptu bands, and then the artists of the group will get together and begin building these kind of strange sculptures. And so very quickly, within only a few hours, every year in Burning Man, this plot of barren desert turns into this beautiful otherworldly utopia full of totally happy and fulfilled and excited strangers. But in 2017, the utopia that was created at that Burning Man was shattered by one man, and his name was Aaron Joel. In 2017, Aaron Joel was a tall, handsome, 41-year-old free spirit who, from the time he was just a little kid, had this sort of restless energy about him. He always needed to be out doing stuff. He could never sit still. And so by the time he was old enough, he left his family home in Oklahoma and moved out to Oregon and moved into this commune. A commune is a group of people that live together and share their possessions and responsibilities. But shortly after moving into this commune, Aaron got restless again. This wasn't enough for him, and so he left the commune and began traveling all over the United States. But after he had basically gone everywhere in the country, he became restless again, and so he left the United States and he went to Nepal and began traveling all over Nepal. And while he was there, he met this wonderful young woman from Switzerland named Ladina, and the two fell madly in love. And then when it was time for Ladina to leave Nepal and go back to her home country, Aaron followed her. And just a couple of years later, in 2014, the pair got married and they bought a house together and settled down in Switzerland. For a time, Aaron and Ladina were very happy. Their life was very simple and straightforward. They loved each other. They loved Switzerland. But in 2017, Aaron's wanderlust reared its head again. And so he went up to Ladina and he told her that, honey, I need to go out and explore again. I need to go out and be free again. Even if it's just for a couple of days or a week or whatever time it is, I need it. I need it in order to be sane. I don't think Ladina was very pleased about this development. However, she knew her husband and she knew this was important to him and to his mental health. And so she said, okay, honey, you do what you have to do. And so Aaron thought about what he was going to do to satiate this desire to go out and be free again, and he settled on attending that year's Burning Man, something he had never done before. So Aaron leaves Switzerland and he goes back to Oregon in the United States, and he meets up with a very close friend of his named Justin. Justin was actually someone he had lived with in the commune when he was there. And so the two, they link up in Oregon, and from there, they drive in Justin's big van out to Nevada. And when they get to Nevada, they drive out to the Burning Man site. And as they're pulling up, they see thousands and thousands of other vans and tents and all these people that are out setting up and building this community, this utopia. And so right away, Aaron and Justin, they find their spot, they park their van, they begin to build their own site. And then after that, they pulled their bikes out of the van and began biking around, helping other people out build their sites and build the rest of the community. And so by that afternoon, Aaron and Justin had made lots of new friends, and they were out partying and dancing and singing with total strangers, just totally immersed in the Burning Man experience. That night, Aaron would actually turn in early while Justin would stay up and continue having a good time with the new people he had met. Aaron was just not a night owl. He liked to get a full night's sleep and then get up early and make himself a smoothie and do yoga. And so this was very normal behavior. Justin would later say that he really looked up to Aaron. And in fact, many people that knew Aaron looked up to him because Aaron, on the one hand, was a total free spirit that would just kind of go where the wind would blow him. But at the same time, he was very regimented and disciplined. He took great care of himself, both physically and mentally, and he just seemed wise beyond his years. And he was incredibly charismatic and very funny, and so people really flocked to him and really idolized him. One of the traditions of Burning Man has to do with its namesake. Towards the end of every Burning Man, they will build this 40-foot tall wooden man effigy, and they will burn it to the ground, hence the name Burning Man. And so on the night night of the so-called man burn, Aaron told Justin that he was not going to turn in early that night, that instead he was going to stay up and watch the spectacle of this effigy being burned to the ground. Justin was really excited about it, and so was Aaron. And so that evening, Aaron and Justin met up with their new friends they had met while they were at Burning Man, and their group began making their way over to the wooden man effigy. Now, this huge effigy was situated in this huge open clearing, and then standing all around this wooden man are what they called rangers. They're basically security guards for the event that also have some fire training, and they would stand almost shoulder to shoulder or very close to shoulder, facing away from the effigy, forming a perimeter around it. And the rangers' job was to prevent the crowd of 70,000 people from getting too close to the effigy when it was on fire, because it's obviously a huge hazard. And so Aaron, Justin, and their friends, when they got to this clearing and saw the effigy, they would have seen thousands and thousands of event attendees converging on this effigy, getting as close to the rangers as they possibly could on all sides. And so Aaron and Justin and their friends, they make their way up to one particular section of this crowd, and they begin fighting their way through all these people, trying to get as close to the rangers as they possibly could, because they want a good view of this man burn. And then once they were satisfied with their view, they just stopped and waited for the effigy to be lit. But before the effigy was lit, Aaron would turn to Justin and say, "Hey, I have some friends from Switzerland who are here right now. They're on the other side of the effigy, on the other side of the crowd, and I'm going to go see them right now." And so Justin was totally bummed that Aaron was going to be leaving right before this thing is lit, because he wanted to experience this with Aaron. But he said, "Okay, no problem. I'll see you hopefully, before this thing gets lit, or, I'll see you after this burn is done." And so Aaron departed the group, and Justin watched as he kind of disappeared into the crowd. And then Justin turned his attention back towards the effigy, and a little while later, when the sun had gone down and it was totally dark out and the crowd was totally electric as they're waiting for this thing to light, finally they did. They lit the effigy, and as soon as it went up in flames, the crowd of thousands and thousands of people roared with excitement. And this whole time, Justin is totally amazed by what he is watching, but he's also scanning the crowd, kind of hoping that Aaron will eventually pop back up. But at this point, the crowd is so massive and everyone's so tight together that Justin is really not expecting Aaron to come back over to where he had been. It just didn't seem possible. And so this huge wooden man effigy goes up in glorious flames, and everyone's so amazed by it. And then eventually the flames begin to dwindle down as the structure continues to burn lower and lower to the ground. And then finally, when the fire is just about out, the crowd of people begin to disperse. And at this point, Justin again looks around hoping to maybe see Aaron, but Aaron has not come back yet. And so Justin just says, "Okay, maybe it's time to leave and go check in with Aaron back at the van." And so he notifies his friends that he's going to turn around and head back. And as Justin turns and begins leaving the crowd, someone who was at the event, who apparently knew Justin and knew Aaron, came running over to Justin and frantically told him this totally shocking story about something that happened to Aaron. Now, at first, Justin just could not believe it. He couldn't even process it. It seemed so outlandish and unbelievable that it just could not have happened. But he was thinking to himself, I haven't seen Aaron since he left to go see his friends from Switzerland, and I have no idea where he is. And so Justin starts looking around the crowd again. He's not seeing Aaron, and he's starting to panic. And so finally, Justin just turns and starts running back towards his van in hopes that Aaron is going to be there. But when he gets back to his van, Aaron is not there, and there's no sign that Aaron has been back after they had left for the man burn. It would turn out that shocking story Justin had been told about Aaron was true. This is that shocking story. After Aaron told Justin that he was going to go to the other side of the crowd and spend some time with his friends from Switzerland, he disappeared from the group and he made his way over to that far side of the crowd. But we don't know if he actually met up with friends from Switzerland or if that was just some cover to get away from Justin and the other people he was with. But regardless, at some point, Aaron made his way over to the other side of the effigy, away from Justin and away from his other friends. And once he was over there, he pushed his way towards the front of the crowd until he was right in front of the rangers with front row seats of the effigy. And then after the effigy was set alight and was fully engulfed in flames, Aaron, at some point, bum rushed one of the rangers right in front of him and was able to push past him. And then before that ranger or any other nearby rangers could stop him, Aaron was able to sprint directly into the bottom of this massive effigy, right into the fire, and he disappeared inside of it. Because the crowd was massive and unruly and many people were under the influence of drugs or alcohol or both, because of all of that, even though Aaron is running into the fire right in front of them, it was like nobody noticed. Everybody was in kind of their own worlds, and it's dark out, there's this fire. I mean, there's so many distractions that really nobody noticed this happening besides the rangers that were immediately affected by Aaron running past them and some of the people that were right at the front of the crowd watching as Aaron did this. And so this is why Justin and the rest of his friends had no idea this had happened, despite the fact they were watching this fire as this was happening. Aaron would ultimately only be inside of the flames for 12 seconds before the rangers were able to go inside and pull him out. But by that time, it was already too late. Aaron would be rushed to the hospital, but he would die that night. It would later be determined that Aaron was completely sober at the time he decided to run into the burning man, which means he was of clear mind when he decided to do this. And so it was determined that his death had to be a suicide. However, his family and his friends and anybody who knew him are just totally not buying the idea that he decided to commit suicide, especially like this. It just didn't make any sense. This is not something Aaron would have done. He was acting totally normally. His behavior was not erratic. Something else must have caused this to happen. But unfortunately, at this point, no one has come close to figuring out what this other thing could be. And so to date, his death still remains largely a mystery. Here is a picture one of the bystanders took of Aaron as he charges into